And for the next hour, we're talking to a man who has had number ones around the world. He's sold millions of albums in the last 50 years, and I'm delighted to be talking to Roger Whittaker. Thank you so much for joining me.
Hi, Alex. How are you doing?
I'm really well, and all the better for seeing you, because when I hear your songs, it makes me want to smile. Why is that?
Well, most of them are pretty happy songs. There are one or two pretty miserable ones as well, but most of them uplift you. You know, like New World in the Morning and Durham Town and Don't Believe in If Anymore. These songs tend to lift your spirits, and there's been a couple of others that were really quite funny, like First Hello, Last Goodbye. Makes people smile. It's something they say, yeah, that happened to me, or I know that. Yeah, that applies to humans.
What is your greatest skill? Is it your voice or your choice of songs?
Well, I write a lot of the songs that people come to hear, but there are other songs that I sing, like River Lady, for instance, which is a great country song. And sometimes these things are hits to my greatest surprise, you know. So, I mean, when If came out, a week later it was number 12 in the charts or something, and I went, what? That chart was open on the death. Nobody had even told me, you know. I think really if you're a relaxed singer, you've got to just ease off and let it come out, you know.
How has your voice changed in the last few years? Because in my opinion, having seen you warm up, it's getting deeper and deeper. That's got to be great for you, hasn't it? Because that's what your audience loves.
Yes, they like the deep notes, but you also got to be able to sing some of the high ones. I write songs with a great range, you know. I wrote a song called Wildwood Rose, about a wild rose of Ireland who marries this fisherman, and he goes off to fish, and he says, if I don't come back, then say a prayer for me on the beach. And it's got sort of like an octave and a half range, so you have to tighten your stomach muscles and really go for it. But you're quite right, it is getting deeper. The voice gets deeper, and the hearing you lose the tops, and so you sing deeper because you can hear that better. And your wife, as she gets older, gets better. Her hearing is the top hearing. This is why so many older married people have a row when they're watching television. Turn it down a bit. I can't hear it if you turn. So this is exactly why.
I thought you were saying your wife was getting louder and louder as well.
Well, yeah, more strident, put it that way. No, she's not here. Okay. I can say what I like.
We're going to talk about the mixture of songs you do, because I bought an album of yours in America a few years ago called Awakening, which I thought was just such a great album. It was so different from the rest of the stuff you do. But now let's talk about the beginning, because you've had such an interesting life and such a varied life as well. You've worked all over the world, and you were born in Nairobi in Kenya.
Yeah.
Now, I'm fascinated to talk to you about this, because I actually worked there for about 9 months on a radio show. I was saying to you before the program, it was my happiest and most sad time, because it's just such a confused place and diverse place, yet it's so beautiful. How did you find it?
Well, when I was growing up, of course, it was very different. It was a colonial setup, and it was quite remarkable because we were closeted people, really, I have to say. And we went to pretty good schools, and we had a life that was very wide open. Our parents were so busy doing stuff, you know, creating something out of nothing. I mean, my father went there in 1929. My mother married him there in 1930. And I was born there in 1936. Don't spread that around too much, but anyway. And while I was growing up, I realized I had a very privileged and wonderful life. And I drove tractors on a 100,000-acre wheat farm. Can you believe that? 100,000 acres of wheat. Can you imagine how much that is? And it belonged to a guy called Stan Morgan, and I used to drive his tractors and keep the wild animals out of his farm by, I'm afraid, shooting them if they got into the wheat. And we lived on zebra and wildebeest and Congoni, and we had the dogs ate what we didn't eat. And it was a really, as you say, a happy but very dangerous time. I'd come home at night with ticks up to my knees, black. My legs would be black with ticks, off the wild animals that were roaming around. You could walk among a herd of zebras and pat them on the rump, and they wouldn't bother. They didn't see any danger in you, you know. And every night I'd get into this bath of Dettol, and these ticks would die and just come and leave my flesh, you know, and go off. But they carried all kinds of diseases: red water fever, typhus of all sorts. And I had once or twice in my life, I had diseases that nobody knew what they were. I said, well, something's infecting this boy because he gets a temperature of 104 at night, and yet in the daytime he doesn't have it. So what is it? It's an infection of unknown origin.
So if I go back to Kenya tomorrow, then I could catch the Roger Whittaker, could I?
You could.
How did you find the fact that you were living what is probably a privileged life compared to most of the people in Kenya? Did you find that difficult? Because that for me was the hardest thing.
Well, we didn't feel quite the same way. We didn't have apartheid, believe me, we didn't. But we had friends who were black. Most of the friends I had were black kids because our parents, as I say, were busy doing stuff. So as we grew up, we had nannies that were black people. We had their children to play with as friends, and I spoke their language before I spoke my own. My mother thought I'd never speak English at all. I played African instruments. I learned African folk songs. I also learned George Formby songs, and I also learned all the country songs that came in from America, because the Africans loved the country music with its guitars, and they'd make an African guitar out of skin and an old tin and a kind of harp structure, or else they'd save up and buy one. I was luckier because the Italian prisoners of war that was sent from North Africa, there was a big battle up there in the Second World War, and when the Italians surrendered, which they did by the hundreds of thousands, they came down to Kenya, and we welcomed them with open arms. They built bridges and roads and churches, and they played rugby with us, and a lot of them stayed afterwards. And my sister and I, she must have been about 8 maybe, and I was about 5, 6. We'd go down and watch them, and they took a shine to us, and one day they gave me a guitar and my sister a mandolin. That was my first guitar. So you see, music was in my blood from when I was little to right now. I couldn't get it out of my system.
Are you intending to go back?
Well, I write about it a lot, and I make movies about it. I made a magical musical safari of Kenya, and take movies again and write the second part. I'm writing with a friend of mine called Howard Elson, a show called Getty, which is about a small village that used to exist just south of Mombasa on the Kenya coast, and it had a sultan. Mombasa had a sultan, and Zanzibar had a sultan. So, it was an exciting time. It was an exciting time, and the Arabs owned this whole coastline, and the slavery took place from there up till 1912, can you believe it? And the gold standard was kept at Getty. It's a fascinating story, and all this, yes, it's very much in my heart. I'd love to go back. I really would love to go back. I just wish that Africa would resolve itself.
How do you think of yourself? Are you African? Are you British? What are you?
Well, I've always had a British passport. My parents came from the Midlands. They came from Staffordshire. My father came from Newcastle under Lyme, and my mother came from Basford, or the other way around. And I have thousands of relatives up there to whom I send my fondest wishes. And I've played up there many times. When I'm around there, I go and see them. My son was born when I was performing in Hanley, and they all turned out. And by the time I came on stage, all the champagne had been drunk.
You then went to study, didn't you? Because you wanted to become a teacher. No showbiz yet.
No, I tell you what happened. All my young life, my mother had said, I want you to be a doctor. I want you to be a doctor. I think she was secretly in love with a doctor that we had called Dr. Boyle, who was a 6'2" Irish, blue-eyed, thick black eyebrows. He used to scare the life out of me. This guy frightened me to death. He would look at you and beetle his eyes. Now, I shot a pellet into my thumb when I was a kid, and he had to dig it out. And he had to go behind the bone and pull it out. And when I woke up, this blood-covered pellet was right in front of my nose. And I looked up, and he was shoving it almost up my nostril. He frightened me to death, but my mother wanted me to be a doctor. She kept on pushing it into my brain, which was fine until Mama came along in about 1952. Then we were all in the army anyway. You went in, and that was the end of it. Come on, boys, you've got to come and fight these guys. And if you were frightened in Nairobi when you were doing your radio broadcast, you should have been with us, I tell you.
Yeah.
It was they were so good at what they did, these guys, and there was no no mercy given, no mercy at all. If you weren't one of them, you'd had it, especially if you were black, Anyhow, after all that, suddenly I was an adult, I left school and I went along with what had been decided before I left school, and I went down to South Africa for a couple of years and studied medicine. But at the end of 2 years, I thought, what am I doing? I don't want to do this. And I went home and my parents were furious. Well, what are you going to do? And I said, well, my mother's family were all educationalists. They were directors of education for Staffordshire. Her father was a headmaster and so on. So I said, well, maybe it's in my blood. I'll go and try teaching. And I have to say, the sound of, the risk of sounding over the top, I loved it. I enjoyed every minute of it, and I was good at it. And I was lucky because I taught in a school I went to myself, you see, so I knew all the tricks. I knew where all the smoking holes were and everything.
Why teaching then? Was it because it's the same as show business? You've got people looking at you?
Yeah, you can communicate. And if they were bored, I'd take my guitar out and say, okay, I'll show you how to play the guitar. And my class, honestly, was the best class in the school, I reckoned. I said, you're the best, you're going to be the best. And I set the maths paper, and I had to make it easier for everyone else. All my kids got 100%. So then I went on to taught more or less adults, 18-year-olds down to 16. And I loved that. And I said, okay, I'd like to go to a university now in order to learn sciences to teach to adults. And so this is what I did. And I went to Bangor, North Wales. And I got a degree in zoology, but biochemistry was my subject. That's the one I fell in love with. And at that time, of course, biochemistry was an evolving thing. Nobody thought, biochemistry, what's that about? Nobody knew. People were just studying DNA and finding out what made cells tick and so on. And it was all new stuff that was being pushed into our brains. And eventually I fell in love with it, and I did very well with it. And they offered me a post researching there, and I had a professor called Charles Evans. And he said, stay and research with us, stay and do and get, maybe even you'll get a doctorate if you're lucky. I said, I'd love to do that, but I want to get the singing business out of my system. So I'll just go off for a year and then I'll come back. He said, I tell you what, I'll give you 10 years. If in 10 years you're finished with it, come back and you can carry on, which was very generous of him because, of course, I didn't go back. 43 years later now, I realize that I never would.
You mentioned in 1956 you did national service, and you were 20 when you did that. Did it change you forever? Did it give you a new perspective on life? Because it must have been tortuous.
It was the most wonderful period of my life. It really was. I was with all my pals from school. All of us were in there together. We all grew up together. We all became men. We all learned discipline. I did a concert for in Berlin when they had the last parade of the British Army, and I sang the last farewell and so on, and I thought I'll have a chat with the lads, and I was walking around talking, and a sergeant major was by my side, and I happened to say I was once in the British Army myself. And he looked at me and said, right, you'll have learned to do as you're told then. And I really think this is with reference to today's society, I truly believe that conscription would be a good thing. Not because people should be ordered to shoot or kill or go to Iraq and all that. The discipline that the army gives you, the actual camaraderie, the friends you make, the fact that everybody relies on you to stay alive, is so important to young people. I think it's a disaster that they don't have the privilege of going through it just for 6 months, You'd come out of there a different person, a totally different person. You'd look at your family differently. You wouldn't fight with your pa anymore, You'd be able to see his point of view, or if you didn't, you'd shut your mouth,
We're here today with Roger Whittaker for an exclusive hour-long program. We're going to take a piece of music now that internationally has been your big success. We're going to go back and talk about how you started in a moment from now in your work in Ireland, which really set you up for this huge career. Yeah. But you've had so much success around the world, particularly in America, which is very rare. What was your biggest hit over there then?
Well, I went to Rio in '69, and I met people who were later to be really good friends, like James Last and the guy that wrote The Pink Panther, who was with RCA, you know. All these people. I went with Malcolm Roberts was singing for England, and I was singing for Kenya, you know. And I had a new song called New World in the Morning, and I just had a number one in France with Mexican Whistler. And I got there, and I was sitting there on my stool, and I sang. There was about an 80-piece orchestra, whatever it was. And they played New World in the Morning beautifully. They'd been practicing it for weeks, and I just sat there and sang it. It was wonderful. Then they said, what else are you going to do? And I had nothing else. And I thought, oh, this is interesting. So I just had an idea, and I said, no, I don't need anybody but the percussion players. So the percussion players stayed behind, and I did Mexican Whistler. 2 little run-throughs, and they had it perfectly. And I'm not lying to you, it was the hit of the whole 3-week festival. All the taxi drivers remembered, out of all the singers, you the whistler. And I said, yeah, me. And they went, oh, very. And 4 versions came out, all by somebody else. Right. Yeah, well, 4 different guys had written it, you know. Anyhow, New World in the Morning was heard by the Americans in Rio and taken to New York, and I was signed to RCA. And that was 69. 71, I recorded a song called The Last Farewell. And it was on an album that had, I think, 4 hits on it, If and New World and all these songs. And so Dennis Preston, who's a famous record producer in his day, said to me, we can't take any more off this album. We better just leave it. And he sent it to America, and it just stayed there and fulminated away. And then 4 years later, the wife of a director of a radio station in Atlanta said, what happened to that song I like? Play it for me. And so this DJ put this song on, and everybody went crazy, and he started to play it. And they rang me and said, listen, this song's getting a huge reaction in Atlanta. Now, RCA didn't have any in New York, but it was out in Canada. So we shipped it in by the hundreds of thousands. And before we knew what had happened, we had a song that was in the American top 20 for months and months and months. It was played on the radio for years and years. The British put it out, was number 2 in Great Britain for weeks and weeks and weeks. It was just a strange moment in the pop industry when there was it's happened sometimes where there was a momentary gap where nothing seemed to be catching everybody's imagination. Rod Stewart put out Sailing, and I put out The Last Farewell. He sold like 300 records a day more than me, so he was 1 and I was 2. And we got to know each other, and we laughed about it. And this opened the way for a whole new album of songs that these people had never heard. They didn't know New World that well. It had been a minor hit. I Don't Believe in If, River Lady, If I Were a Rich Man, all these songs, Durham Town, all these songs had never been really heard by Americans. And then came the truly lucky decision. It was put on television. It was advertised on television. And for once, the record company and the people advertising it on TV did a deal. There was no arguments, no problems. And it sold millions because it was on television. I was the first guy ever to do it.
And it couldn't happen again, could it now?
Well, I don't think it would happen because about 1 million people after me tried the same trick. You know, you'd have Izzy Gesploff, the Icelandic trumpeter, world famous in the rest of the world, but here in America unknown. So we're bringing his work to your ear, and he'd play Edelweiss. And you know what I'm trying to say?
Absolutely.
The secret was that this album was a genuine album. It was genuinely hits they didn't know.
And then you decided to come back to the UK to study, and you were offered a summer season with Frank Carson in Northern Ireland, and that really launched your career, didn't it?
It was huge because I had a minor hit with a song called Steel Men while I was still at university. And I said to my dad, I'll just go for a year and get it out of my system. This hit will die away, and probably my whole career will die away. So, don't worry about it. And they said, oh, okay. So I went into summer season with a fellow called Billy Livingston and another guy called Frank Carson and a whole lot of Irish stars, you know, and I was singing Scarlet Ribbons and so on. And suddenly one of the crew left and I had to be Frank Carson's straight man. And my parents came to see the show. It was this in Port Rush, Northern Ireland, you can't imagine. And they arrived just in time to see Frank Carson pour a jug of water down the front of my trousers. And that was enough for them. My mother cried. She said, we've educated you to this point and now look, you're a buffoon, you're a fool to the people. And they never, ever reconciled themselves to my being in the entertainment business. And the strange part of it was it wouldn't let me go. It wouldn't. If I'd have had an ounce of common sense, I should have gone straight back to university and said to Charles Evans, you're right, I'm here, I'm back, let's get on with it. But I didn't. It was one of those things, you know, I just got my teeth into it. It's like a bulldog, which I also have. I admire their character. And I just got my teeth into it and stuck with it and stuck with it and stuck with it. And slowly but surely it all came right, you know. And the luck came my way and I picked the right songs to sing and I was in the right place with the right people watching. And slowly but surely, and luckily I was educated in French because I made 6 albums in French, all of which were very successful. And then promoters came to see me in France and they said, come and sing in Quebec. And I went to sing in Quebec and had many hits there. Then the English said, what the hell is this? They said, there's an Englishman singing in French in France. What's he done here? And they put out Durham Town and I went to Finland to work because I never thought it would ever be a hit. But it was, and I'd written Don't Believe in If, which was, The New World in the Morning, which was. Then I had the radio series in 71, and that produced What Love Is, Why, and The Last Farewell, Mammy Blue from a festival I did in France. These things all, once you start, they go like a stone, rolling down a hillside of snow, you know. And I did tours. Instead of just doing cabaret and working men's clubs, suddenly I had to get an act and do a show, you know. But luckily I'd been prepared for it. All the places that are shut now were not shut then. And so I was accustomed to getting an audience in my hand in a minute. And I did this French tour and it was a huge success. And I learned about wine and I learned about food. And then suddenly the English scene took off and I did the whole Commonwealth, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, all over Canada. And then America took off, so I did all over America. And it's 10 years since I've toured England, can you imagine?
So help me with this then. When you were that child in the field, in the tractor, in Kenya, did you think you were going to be a star then? When did you know that Roger Whittaker was going to be known by everybody virtually in the world?
Very late. Very late. You'd be stupid to think it's going to happen when you're struggling to make it.
But you must have believed you had something to carry on trying to make it.
I always knew I could sing. You know, I always knew I could sing and I knew I could entertain because I used to entertain my mates in the army. So I thought, I mustn't waste this. There's got to be something coming out of this. And so slowly it went on. But my father still got a sour expression when he looked at my... He takes, the albums and look at them. He was photographed for the East African Standard looking at my album. Yeah. And he had this face which was so expressive. And he was looking, look at this rubbish. I listened to Paganini and Mozart, and he hated it. Yeah, anyway, no, I must have known inside that it was going to work. But you couldn't... you have to be realistic, you know.
When was the moment that you knew you were a star? What was the single moment when you thought, I have made it? Was there a certain check that came through the post, or was there a record that you heard? Was it the first time you heard yourself on the radio?
No. I've got a wife who spends it faster than I can make it, so it wasn't a check. No, I think it was in the Radio City Music Hall in New York, because we did a very nice thing, I have to say. UNESCO came to me, you know, little left wing, but they came to me and they do good work. And they said, what can you do to help us raise money to look after children in the 53 countries we're represented in? And I said, well, I did this thing for British BBC Radio where I asked the listeners to send in a lyric, and we received over 1 million in 26 weeks, and I've got some wonderful songs out of it. So why don't we ask the children who are under 13? If we asked everybody, we'd get 2-3 million, and we'd be snowed under. So we get the children to do it themselves. We give them a title, Children Helping Children. And we say, write a song with that title in mind, and if I like it, I'll record it. We'll get the author flown to New York, and we'll sing it for the first time at the Radio City Music Hall in a big concert with the Harlem Boys Choir. So we did this, and we received 1 million. And I picked one that was a standout. It was absolutely amazing. And it was written by a girl called Odina Batnang, and she was 12, and she came from the Philippines, and she wrote it not only in her own language, Tagalog, but in English. So she was a bright kid. And I wrote this song, I Am But a Small Voice, and rehearsed it with the Harlem Boys Choir. And we got on the stage at the Radio City Music Hall, and those big, tough New Yorkers you read so much about were in tears. It was just such a huge success, you can't imagine. And it raises money for them to this day. So it was a very good thing to do. And I think that was a defining moment for me. I thought, well, this is something really worthwhile. This is a good thing to do, you know.
In our remaining moments, we're going to talk about your family and your daughters and your sons and your life now, because we've got so much to talk about. But before we go, talking of raising money, you did this song for the tsunami. A, why did you decide to do it? And B, how did you begin to write a song about it?
Well, my wife Natalie and I went to Thailand for Christmas. We were invited by the brother of a guy who owns a lot of the hotels there, an American. And he said, yeah, bring them over. We'll have a good time. We'll book them up nice rooms, and we'll put them on the boat to go up the river and see all the prayer sites and the old capital and so on. They'll have a wonderful time. And I'd never been there, so I said, okay. So I told the children they could go and visit each other this particular Christmas. And we set off. And then, of course, on Boxing Day, I was getting over the jet lag, lying in bed, and the phone went, and somebody said, put your television on. And I turned the TV on, and that was the end of any holiday. I mean, you couldn't sit there and enjoy yourself. It was before all the amateur video came out, and even that was horrifying enough. But once the amateur video started to come out, and you saw babies being swept out to sea and bodies floating, and it was unbelievable. And it upset us terribly, and it upset Bill Heineke, who owned all the hotels, because he had hotels down in the south, you know. And he lost some of his staff, and he knew them all personally, and it was a disaster. And finally, one day we were out, a few days later, we were on a catamaran, and we were having a bit of a few glasses of champagne and stuff. And a fella came up to me and he said, listen, I'm the manager of the Britney Spears of Thailand. Why don't you write her a song? And I said, okay. So I went out and bought a guitar and spent 2 weeks composing this song. Went into the studio, put the track down. She came in, she sang it, and then I brought the track back and sang it in German and in English. And we put it on this album.
How difficult was it finding the right words? Because one wrong word could just ruin the mood, couldn't it? You've got to be so careful with these types of songs.
I tell you, quite honestly, it was one of the toughest things I've ever done, and I had to decide whether to do it in a minor or a major key. So I did 2 versions. I did one in a major key and one in a minor key, and the minor key was so strong and sad, but good, you know. So this was my decision, but I was working on words till the last minute, you know, beneath or below, and all this stuff going on. And in the end, it was really a lovely thing.
You mentioned that they really weren't very supportive of you at all in terms of show business, and I wondered if they ever came round to approving of what you'd achieved in your career, or at least enjoying what you'd achieved in your career.
I can tell you a funny story. They did This Is Your Life on me, okay. My sister came over from Belgium or wherever she was with her husband. Guys came from Canada, the United States, Kenya, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, everywhere. They called my mother and said, Mrs. Whittaker, we'd like you to come over for This Is Your Life with your son. We'll send you first class tickets and we'll look after you and you can stay as long as you like. No. I said, well, can we send a crew out to no. Well, can we telephone and interview? No. I'm not becoming part of his advertising schemes, you see. So I said, oh, that was a shame. So finally we got a DVD or whatever is the equivalent is, a videotape. And some friends had it and they said to my mother and father, Ted, Vi, come round and look at it. They said, no.
So what was it? Why were they so...
You tell me. I've absolutely no idea.
I mean, that must be hard for you to deal with and for you to cope with, because all we want in life is for our mother and father to approve of what we're doing, isn't it?
I gave them nothing against my mother and father, but they just were so set against this thing and so disappointed. I think they never really forgave me. They wouldn't accept gifts. They came to see us once or twice, and they finally came on their own and never told us they were here. It's the strangest thing. I mean, I think they just hated the whole idea to such an extent that they couldn't see me enjoying it or profiting from it. They thought it just wasn't worthwhile.
Do you think they were petrified of you failing and they just didn't want you to do that, or was that nothing to do with it?
I don't think that was anything to do with it. I think they would have welcomed me crawling home on my tummy, to be honest. When I got married, they came over in the aeroplane and they walked through, and I think they were expecting me to marry some floozy, some tart from Brighton or somewhere. And when they met Natalie, they were so shocked. They really rather liked her, which upset them terribly.
Has that affected your relationship with your children? Because you must want to not make the same mistake and make them feel bad about what they're doing, presumably.
Well, I love my kids to death. We had our 40th wedding anniversary last August, and they gave such a lovely speech. All 5 of them stood there. I have to say, tears running down my face. They are really magnificent children. Well, they're adults now and getting on with their lives.
At this point in your career now, is that your greatest achievement, that you've made 5 people that have gone on to be 5 successful people? Yes,
it's having a family that you're proud of is the most important thing in your life, and that's why it's a little upsetting that Mum and Dad weren't proud of me. But you've just got to get on and live the life you're destined to live, and this voice has followed me throughout my life, and we've seen through all the tough times and the easy times, and we've had a fantastic life, I have to say.
You retired 5 years ago, yet you're back doing your shows again, you're back releasing CDs, you're working harder than ever. Why? Why did you decide to come back?
Well, Nats is Irish, you see, which means no 2 days are the same. And we went to Ireland on our honeymoon, and we both fell in love with it totally. Me from working there and going there on honeymoon, and she from being born in London but being Irish. And we went to meet all her relatives, and we made a deal. I said, when I slow down a bit, we'll come and live in Ireland. So in 2001, I'd had the flu for 5 solid weeks. And I came to Vienna, and there were 10,000 people there. And by the time I got there, I decided this was a portent, because the show was on the 21st of March. My 65th birthday was on the 22nd. And I had time to warn all my friends that this was the end of it. And I told the record company, everybody, and they all got in a plane and came over, and we had a hell of a party in Vienna. And it was wonderful, and I smoked a cigar, and it was great. And after 6 months of living in Ireland, I began to get restless, and starting to write songs, and I thought, what's missing, And all the kids had taken bets on how long it would be before I was back singing songs again. And eventually I said, look, I've got some great songs here. And the record company said, good, because you owe us 2 albums. So I recorded the albums, and then, of course, had to go back to support them. And, here I am.
Roger Whittaker, it's been a real honour meeting you today and talking to you about this new album. And I wish you all the success with your tours in the future. I know you're going to go from success to success. And the last song I'd like to play is a song that I heard you talk about 10 years ago, possibly longer, that you did with your daughter called A Perfect Day. And it's such a perfect song to end with, really, because it's just positive and you can just hear the love through the song. It's really quite remarkable.
Yes, on stage I say, well, I Should Have Had Dogs was the song that I wrote about our kids when they were kicking up. And I go on about kids and how they can get under your skin.